This is a spoiler warning for the 1977 film Eraserhead, directed by David Lynch.
Oh, you are sick. Some inane, bizarre person with a disturbed mind wrote that film.
It's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. It was the best thing I've seen all year.
This time I interpret it as a nightmare.
Today, our guest is Plato. He is most known for his cave allegory. We showed him the film for the very first time and asked him for his thoughts on it. Today, we are at an undisclosed location somewhere in Greece, where I have Plato sitting in front of me. Hello, Plato. How are you today?
Yasu?
That must be Greece for hello, nice to meet you.
Well, I'm fine. How about you, sir?
I am fine and dandy. Now, we've watched Eraserhead together for the first time. Could you summarize the story in your own words?
First of all, Eraserhead is a quite symbolic piece, so it's rather difficult to narrow its content down to a simple summary. But the story revolves around this man, Henry, who lives in a highly industrialized world. Industrialized to an extent that there's nothing left but apartment complexes and factories. It is the topic of love that then triggers a line of events which ultimately changes Henry's position in the world. This change in position and its mental impact constitute the story that David Lynch is trying to tell.
Okay, Plato, that was very vague. Could you narrow it down and tell us some of the most important plot points?
There are two events at the core of the story. On the one hand, there's the relationship of Henry and his girlfriend, which acts as an anomaly in the distant and somewhat mechanical world of Eraserhead, and deals as a precondition for everything else. And on the other hand, there's the birth of the alien child, which directly results from the first condition. This results in Eraserhead being a story about parenthood in the first place. Lynch puts the major discomfort of an estranged parent confronted with the responsibility toward their child on display, by physically separating father and child through a discrepancy in species. The alienation of Henry is aggravated when his girlfriend leaves him and his responsibilities towards the child are increased, until they take over his whole life. Ultimately, Henry accidentally kills his child because he doesn't know how to take care of it. Further, Lynch hints at the preceding death of Henry through suicide.
Well, recently I've heard a lot about estrangement and alienation from our former guest, Karl Marx. I believe you have a different kind of alienation in mind in this case. You seem to focus more on the family life than the mechanical industrial world, which I believe is quite interesting. Thank you for the summary. I think the listeners might now have a solid grasp of what the film is about. How is your personal opinion on the piece?
To make things clear, I don't believe that personal opinion does matter at all when engaging with a piece of art. Who am I to judge the deeply personal and earnest work of another person? But because you've asked so directly, I'm a little lukewarm on the film as a whole. I appreciate its abstract and evocative imagery. Further, I'd really like the commitment to creating a vibe. But content-wise, it unfortunately falls a little flat, especially regarding the core topics that I've mentioned before. Lynch stages a pretty cynical view on parenthood that is successful in depicting its downsides, but doesn't really go further than communicating this immense feeling of being overwhelmed. So the layer of meaning evoked by the narrative is not carefully fleshed out, but rather exaggerated for effective purposes. Still, the obscurity of the images, visual and auditory, leave room for a lot of different interpretations. Like I've said before, David Lynch succeeds in creating an evocative world that communicates more than just what the story contains.
You seem to be raising your finger in the air while you talk. This is very interesting. You know what's also quite interesting? Your perspective regarding the fact that the film is generally a beloved cult classic. You're speaking about different layers of meaning embedded in the obscure aspects of the film. How would you need to engage with the film to get a point of productive discourse, and what would be the outcome of this discourse in this case?
Well, I'd argue, like I've pointed out before, that in the first place, the film needs to be treated as an allegory and not a narratively driven artwork. It's not the story of this man, Henry Spencer, and the weird circumstances in which he and his family live that is of interest here, but the systems and social structures that David Lynch stages in this fictional space. Without a doubt, there are certain parallels to industrialized societies in reality. To understand those connections, one must first grasp the modes of operation of the social structure in which Henry lives and how they influence his way of life and penetrate his vision of the world. This understanding of the text can be reached by close reading Eraserhead as an adaptation, or rather a reflection of my allegory of the cave in the context of industrialized, late capitalist society.
Could you give those listeners who have never heard of this allegory a little summary of it?
So, the allegory assumes a physical basic construction in which the human perception of reality is visualized. A darkened cave with a wall erected just a few feet away from the deepest part of it. The wall acts as a partition between several people who were tied to it at birth, so every movement of either limb or head is restricted, and a blazing fire on the other side of the wall, which shines some light on the wall opposite to the captives. They are neither aware of the imprisonment nor of the existence of the real world that lies beyond the cave. The ray of light is then used by the captors as a light source for a never-ending act of puppeteering, where they drag carved images of animals and people along the upper end of the wall, which results in a shadow play projected onto the wall opposite to the chained people. The captives then, due to the lack of knowledge about the real world, assume those images as reality. They can't possibly think that they are anything else, because they can't imagine something beyond this very simple visual impulse. According to this perception of reality, they start to form a social system. First, they will try to communicate with the images and other prisoners. Slowly, they manifest relations of the individuals to each other and to the images. In the final stage, they will unavoidably establish something like a simplified societal structure, which will imply a concept of their reality.
I get you. How does this concept translate to the world of Eraserhead, and specifically the living conditions of the protagonist?
In conclusion, there exists this apparatus, constituted of the basic construction in the cave, the perceived reality of the captive subject and the entirely separated real world, that is not only spatially isolated but also works according to different systems of social and natural law. The mode of interaction with reality that is bestowed upon the subject is constitutive for the way they live and how they place themselves within the context of a societal system. They will not define the promotion to being a citizen of the real world as a goal, because they don't know that the possibility of the ascent from the cave even exists. I would argue that Henry is in a similar position as the subjects in the cave. His living conditions are constituted by a societal system that is bestowed on him and seemingly can't be influenced. Henry is caught up in the same procedures, such as wandering through vast and uninhabited city landscapes, checking for mail and working. The elements that are constitutive of his life are repetitive, always focused on a productive goal, with the exception of intimacy, which I will talk about later on, and arguably just a fraction of what people are able to do in their time on Earth. This situation is aggravated by the birth of the baby and the responsibilities that come along with it. The critique of proletarian life under capitalism that Lynch is articulating here aside, there's a systematic repression of Henry's freedom, bestowed on him by a higher power that he, in my opinion, only perceives vaguely. In the first scene he appears in, he stands in front of an industrialized building complex and a strangely arched square, while he directs his gaze beyond the camera on an undefined object, articulating immense discomfort. He dresses his environment with these sorts of looks throughout the film, on the one hand visualizing this notion of discomfort, and on the other hand revealing the addressee of it as undetermined. Like the people in the cave, Henry is unable to discern the structures responsible for his living conditions, while his life is also inescapably determined by them. Furthermore, the possibility to leave the system or improve his position is out of his reach.
Your characterization of Henry still seems quite abstract to me. How does the interpretation of him as a captive, similar to the prisoners in the cave, benefit in an analysis of this situation?
You have to understand the allegory of the cave not only as a visualization of human perception, but also as a symbolic reflection on the restrictive nature of isolated societal environments. The people in the cave, as well as Henry, don't strive for better living conditions, although you could argue that Henry has a sense of his situation, but not enough evidence to definitively estimate his conditions, nor of an improvement that could possibly be reached. In conclusion, people, as a first step, need to achieve reflective consciousness for their own living conditions, and then, as a second step, inevitably need to become aware of better living conditions that can deal as a goal and ultimately trigger the urge for change. Those steps can't be taken in the situation that is constructed in the allegory of the cave and Eraserhead. Lynch constructs an empty world, mostly constructed of liminal spaces and people that lead similar lives as Henry. Class consciousness doesn't exist beyond the fact of the existence of the obscure figure of a boss that Henry's mentioning of prior work in a factory implies. The comparison to the captives in the cave visualize the claustrophobic situation of Henry. Still, in the allegory, there is a small possibility of ascending the cave against all odds or becoming aware of the outer world. The most important question that results from this interpretation is if the world that Lynch constructs allows Henry the possibility to gain consciousness for a situation, or actively restricts those thought processes, and if the latter is true, How does it secure the unawareness? Is there a loophole for Henry that would help him to escape his captivity?
Oh, from my perspective, the existence of a loophole would suggest a supervisionary system which might be related to the class relations that you've mentioned before, but you don't have to get into the mechanisms of industrialized society, because we have already had an episode of this podcast featuring Karl Marx, who has gone into more detail when regarding this topic. But could you please put the figure of Henry's former boss, of whose existence in the world of Eraserhead we know for a fact, in relation to Henry and his environment?
The boss and Henry are related to each other as the captives in the caves are related to their captors. Henry is caught up in the societal structures that they provide, visualized by Lynch in the predominantly industrial design of landscapes. But the determining factor is that Henry and all the other portrayed citizens don't seem to be aware of their position in the system, which is a product of its mode of operation. This correlation produces the regulation and restriction of Henry's life.
I would also identify another factor of restriction. After the baby was born and his girlfriend left him, he had even less decisive power over what he wanted to do with his free time. This is narratively taken to the extreme by Lynch, by portraying the baby as occupying every aspect of his life. There is that one scene where Henry hears that his neighbor, who he seemingly had an ongoing fling with earlier in the film, enters her flat. He tries to go out into the hallway and see or even meet her, but the baby starts to scream every time he opens the door. How would you interpret this factor?
For me, the baby is merely an advancement of his symbolic imprisonment. It's his pre-existing living condition and environment that allows the baby to act as such a major disruption. The main factor of restriction is still his living condition, and the regulations bestowed on him by parenthood only take another little part from his sparse freedom. Although the baby is the factor that shifts his existence into a state dominated by an absence of freedom, it is not accountable for his overall situation.
You've now articulated a pretty cohesive interpretation of how the overarching structures and regulations are the cause for the living conditions of the people in the world of Eraserhead. How can it be that such easily determinable structures can exist without a major backlash from the oppressed citizens?
I'd like to visualize the answer for this question with the already mentioned Allegory of the Cave, which is, how I should have made clear by now, quite similar to the reality of Henry Spencer. Like I've stated before, the captives will inevitably establish some kind of social system between themselves and the projected images. This system will be based on a set of values and cultural practices that indicate some kind of shared identity. For example, they could create a system of prestige based on who can identify the projected images the fastest or who can predict which images will probably appear next. That practice would entirely satisfy their needs, because it is all that their environment puts in reach of their perception and therefore constitutes their longing. They've constructed the most comfortable system of values within their possibilities and therefore don't think of resisting the overarching system of oppression. The same thing can be seen in Eraserhead. People have arranged their lives within their societal system with the goal to achieve the most comfortable mode of existence for themselves. The parents of Henry's girlfriend have arranged themselves with their jobs. The disabled grandmother is included into the family structure and in the preparation of dinner, with the momentarily satisfaction of a cigarette as a goal, and the children playing in the streets utilize a severed head to get money. Neither of them seems to question those acts and is rather focused on the emotional or economical value they can get out of it immediately, which stimulates the spectrum of happiness that they are accustomed to their whole life. Their system of values is adjusted to the possibilities the environment puts in their reach. The captives get the feeling that they have everything they need, although what is put in reach to their precarious situation is restricted by a ruling power.
Okay. You now have established the interpretation of the citizens of the world from Eraserhead, on the one hand, as subjects to a higher power that is entirely out of their control, and on the other hand, as subjects to a societal structure that simply does not produce critical thoughts of reflection regarding their living condition. But to get back to your question of a loophole, is this enough to characterize the living conditions of Henry as inescapable?
I would say yes. At least in the way David Lynch has constituted the fictional world and its relations. Later in the Allegory of the Cave, I write about the possibility of the escape of a captive and how they will be perceived after their return. Due to the completely different ways in which reality addresses the senses and cognitive abilities, the person who escaped will after a possible return not be able to participate in the ways of living in the cave. The eyes need some time to adjust to the darkness again. Furthermore, the people in the cave will not be able to understand the things that the fugitive tells them about the real world. In combination with the bodily dysfunction for the societal system in the cave, the captives will interpret the other reality as inferior to their own. So there is a minor chance of escape, a loophole in the system that is assumed in the allegory. In contrast, there is no portrayal of such a loophole in the world of Eraserhead. There is no figure of a fugitive that managed to escape and made its way back to report on his experience, and the system is staged vaguely, so that even we, as spectators from the outside, can't locate a possible way out for Henry. In my opinion, this condition is the most important aspect for the creation of the displeasing and grim vibe that pervades the film. Lynch's characters are held captive in an environment that provokes immense discomfort in the protagonist, but is at the same time inescapable. There's an omnipresent notion of claustrophobia that is worsened by the portrayal of a particularly sinister way to escape the situation. Besides the temporary escapism that, for example, intimacy seems to provide, the only way out is naturally occurring or deliberately caused death, which in the end of the narrative frees Henry from a symbolical imprisonment.
That is quite a pessimistic interpretation of the movie. Could you just, as a last point, go further into detail on the role of escapism, especially through intimacy in this context?
Proper intimacy is something that can't be grasped with the allegory of the cave, and therefore constitutes the first major difference between the captives and Henry Spencer. So they are deprived of movement. In this state, bodily intimacy is completely denied, and only mental and emotional intimacy is possible. But I would argue that this form of intimacy is not as effective for escapism as passionate, absolutely physical, bodily affection can be. The power to liberate the body completely from its usual mode of operation in daily life, while also maintaining mental escapism, frees Henry for a short period of time from the restrictions of the societal system and counters the goal-oriented way of living with a more abstract set of motivations.
Like the grandma that was given a cigarette that you just mentioned.
Yes, indeed. A cigarette is also just temporary relief.
Speaking of cigarettes, I believe the lady in the radiator might have something to say about that. Let's cut to her for a short second.
To promote his 2006 movie Inland Empire, Lynch sat on the street with a cow next to him and a poster of Laura Dern. David Lynch started making movies because he wanted to see paintings move. His favorite brand of cigarettes was American Spirit Blue.
Thank you, lady in the radiator, and it is great to know what the favorite type of cigarette was. What did you say about cigarettes again? A temporary relief, like sexual intercourse.
Visually, Lynch communicates this by locating precisely that sexual intercourse of Henry and his neighbor in a pond in the middle of his flat, in which he and his love interest dive into, also physically separating them from reality. Still, I want to highlight that this act only deals as mental escapism and doesn't affect the fact that death is the only loophole in the system.
Well, speaking of death, do you have any last words for our listeners?
A last aspect that I'd like to underline regarding my interpretation is the point of view I've utilized for this analysis. We mainly focus on the parallels between the allegory and the narrative layer of the film, but there are several other readings that would benefit from an examination with the apparatus of the cave in mind. Just to name another way to apply the allegory, a comparison could also be drawn between the narrative, an aesthetic portrayal of dreams, and the dispositive of the cinema, which would identify the viewer as the subject of an apparatus similar to the cave allegory. But that would be pushing the limits of this episode.
It seems as though your voice is slowly fading into obscurity. The verses that I've chanted to get you back to the world of the living must lose their strength. I will now have to send you back to your grave. If that is okay with you, well, don't answer that. I will do it without your consent.
Ah!
And there he goes. Thank you all for listening. This has been the second episode of Scratching Heads. Make sure you don't miss the recap episodes, and I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. We will see you soon enough.